The first thing that caught my attention was the way she packed her bow. Emily was meticulous, always had been, but this time it felt different. She ran her fingers over the curve of the riser, her touch lingering a little too long, like she was saying goodbye to something, or someone. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching her, my coffee cooling in my hand. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting slanted shadows across the floor. She hadn't noticed me yet, and for a moment, I felt like a stranger in my own home. "You sure you don't want to take the rifle?" I asked, finally breaking the silence. My voice sounded too loud, too forced, even to me. She glanced up, her green eyes sharp and focused, like she'd been pulled out of a dream. "You know I prefer the bow," she said, her tone light but firm. "It's more challenging, more intimate." I nodded, though the word intimate stuck in my head like a burr. Emily had always been passionate about hunting, especially with her bow. She'd grown up in a family where hunting wasn't just a pastime, it was a way of life. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was just a kid, and she'd been hooked ever since. I, on the other hand, was more of a casual participant. I didn't mind tagging along, but I'd never felt the same connection to it that she did. Still, I loved watching her in her element. She was confident, capable, and utterly in control. It was one of the things I admired most about her. But today, something felt off. She'd been distant all morning, her mind somewhere else. She'd barely touched her breakfast, and when I'd tried to make conversation, her responses had been short, almost clipped. I told myself it was just pre-trip jitters, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. We loaded up the truck in silence, the only sound the crunch of gravel under our boots. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your lungs and makes you feel alive. Emily climbed into the passenger seat, her bow case resting across her lap like a prized possession. I slid behind the wheel, my hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than necessary. The drive to the lodge was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the air before a storm. When we arrived, the lodge was already buzzing with activity. Hunters in camo gear milled about, their voices carrying on the wind. Emily's face lit up as she spotted our guides, Mike and Travis, standing near a beat-up pickup truck. Mike was tall and broad-shouldered, with a friendly smile and a handshake that could crush bones. Travis, on the other hand, was lean and wiry, his face shadowed by a scruffy beard. He had the kind of quiet intensity that made you take notice, even if he wasn't saying much. Emily was the first to approach them, her stride confident and purposeful. "Mike, Travis," she said, nodding to each of them in turn. "Good to see you again." Mike grinned. "Emily, always a pleasure." "Jack," he added, turning to me. "Good to have you both here." Travis didn't say much, just gave a curt nod and a half-smile. But I noticed the way his eyes lingered on Emily, the way he seemed to straighten up a little when she was near. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And I didn't like it. We spent the next hour going over the plan for the hunt. Emily was in her element, her excitement palpable as she talked about tracking elk through the mountains. She and Travis seemed to speak the same language, their conversation peppered with terms and references that went over my head. I tried to keep up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the outside looking in. "You ever hunt with a bow before?" Travis asked me at one point, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. "Not really," I admitted. "I'm more of a rifle guy." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's a different kind of hunt. Takes patience. Skill." He glanced at Emily, and there was something in his gaze that made my stomach twist. "Emily's one of the best I've seen." She smiled at the compliment, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, something I couldn't quite place. Pride, gratitude, or something more. By the time we finished packing our gear and loading up the ATVs, the sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. Emily climbed onto the back of Travis's ATV without a second thought, her bow slung over her shoulder. I watched as she settled in behind him, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders. It was a small thing, innocent enough, but it felt like a punch to the gut. "You good?" Mike asked, snapping me out of my thoughts. I forced a smile. "Yeah. Let's go." As we headed into the mountains, the tension in my chest grew tighter with every mile. The scenery was breathtaking. Towering pines, jagged peaks, the occasional flash of a deer darting through the underbrush, but I couldn't enjoy it. My eyes kept drifting to Emily and Travis, their heads close together as they talked. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was reading too much into things. But the knot in my stomach wouldn't go away. By the time we reached our campsite, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. We set up camp quickly, the routine motions of pitching tents and building a fire providing a temporary distraction. But as the night settled in and the fire crackled between us, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Emily sat across from me, her face glowing in the firelight. She looked beautiful as always, but there was a distance in her eyes that I couldn't bridge. Travis sat beside her, his presence like a shadow at the edge of my vision. The conversation flowed easily, but I felt like an outsider, like I was watching a scene play out that I wasn't meant to be a part of. And then, as the fire burned low and the others began to turn in for the night, I saw it. Emily reached out to touch Travis's arm, her fingers brushing against his sleeve in a gesture that was casual, almost unconscious. But the way he looked at her, the way his eyes softened, just for a moment, told me everything I needed to know. My heart sank, the weight of it pressing down on me like a stone. I wanted to say something, to confront her, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I sat there, staring into the dying embers of the fire, the truth settling over me like a shroud. The hunting trip had barely begun, but I already felt like I'd lost something I couldn't get back. The storm hit without warning. One moment, the sky was a clear, endless blue, and the next, it was a swirling mass of dark clouds, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Emily and Travis had been tracking an elk for hours, their movements silent and deliberate, the kind of synchronicity that comes from shared skill and instinct. I'd stayed behind at camp with Mike, my lack of experience making me more of a liability than an asset in the field. But as the storm rolled in, my unease grew into something sharper, more urgent. "They'll be fine," Mike said, his voice calm but his eyes scanning the horizon. "Travis knows these mountains like the back of his hand. He'll get her to safety." I nodded, but the words did little to ease the knot in my chest. The wind picked up, sending leaves and debris swirling through the air. The temperature dropped sharply, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and doesn't let go. I pulled my jacket tighter, my eyes never leaving the tree line. "They should have been back by now," I muttered, more to myself than to Mike. He didn't respond, but I could see the concern etched into his features. We both knew how quickly things could go wrong in the mountains, especially in a storm like this. In the cave, the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and the faint tang of smoke from the small fire Travis had managed to build. Emily sat close to the flames, her arms wrapped around herself, her breath visible in the cold air. Travis was a few feet away, his back against the rough stone wall, his eyes fixed on the entrance of the cave. The storm raged outside, the wind screaming like a banshee, but inside, there was a strange, almost oppressive silence. "We'll be okay," Travis said finally, his voice low and steady. "Once the storm passes, we'll head back." Emily nodded, but she didn't look at him. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Fear, guilt, and something else she couldn't quite name. The cave felt smaller somehow, the walls closing in around her. She could feel Travis's presence like a physical thing, a weight pressing against her chest. "I shouldn't have pushed so far out," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is my fault." Travis shook his head. "You didn't know the storm was coming. Neither of us did." She glanced at him then, her eyes meeting his in the flickering light of the fire. There was something in his gaze, something raw and unguarded, that made her breath catch in her throat. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire. And then, without thinking, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his hand. It was a small gesture, almost unconscious, but it was enough to break the fragile tension that had been building between them. Travis's hand turned, his fingers intertwining with hers, and suddenly the distance between them was gone. The kiss was sudden, desperate, a collision of heat and need that left them both breathless. Emily's mind screamed at her to stop, to pull away, but her body betrayed her, leaning into him, her hands gripping his jacket like a lifeline. For a moment, the storm outside faded away, the world narrowing to just the two of them. But then reality came crashing back, cold and unrelenting. Emily pulled away, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with shock and guilt. "What are we doing?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Travis didn't answer, his expression a mixture of regret and something darker, something she couldn't quite place. He looked away, his jaw tightening, and the silence between them grew heavier. By the time the storm subsided and they made their way back to the lodge, Emily's guilt had settled into a hard, unyielding knot in her stomach. She avoided my eyes when they returned, her movements stiff and deliberate. I wanted to ask her what had happened, to demand answers, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I watched as she disappeared into our tent, her shoulders hunched like she was carrying the weight of the world. That night, as I lay beside her, listening to the sound of her breathing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The distance between us felt wider than ever, a chasm I didn't know how to cross. And as I stared up at the dark canvas of the tent, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd already lost her. The storm had passed, but the damage it had left behind was only just beginning to surface. The first thing I noticed when we got home was the silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the kind of silence that felt heavy, suffocating, like the air before a thunderstorm. Emily moved through the house like a ghost, her footsteps barely making a sound, her eyes avoiding mine at every turn. She'd been like this since we left the mountains, distant and withdrawn, and I didn't know how much longer I could take it. I tried to give her space, to tell myself that she just needed time to process whatever had happened out there. But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces didn't add up. The way she'd looked at Travis, the way she'd avoided my questions, the way she'd flinched when I touched her, it all pointed to something I didn't want to face. Finally, one night, I couldn't take it anymore. We were sitting in the living room, the TV on but neither of us really watching it. The tension between us was so thick it felt like you could cut it with a knife. I turned to her, my heart pounding in my chest, and said the words I'd been dreading. "Emily, we need to talk." She froze, her eyes wide with something that looked like fear. For a moment, she didn't say anything, just stared at me like she was trying to figure out how much I knew. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "What happened out there? You've been different since we got back. And I need to know why." She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together in her lap. For a long time, she didn't say anything, and I started to wonder if she was going to answer at all. Then, finally, she spoke. I made a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "A terrible mistake." My stomach dropped, the words hitting me like a punch to the gut. I'd known deep down that something was wrong, but hearing her say it out loud made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. "What kind of mistake?" I asked, my voice tight. She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with tears. I kissed Travis," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "In the cave, during the storm. It just happened. I didn't mean for it to, but it did, and I've been so ashamed and guilty ever since." The room spun around me, her words echoing in my head like a bad dream. I felt like I'd been sucker punched, the air knocked out of my lungs. I wanted to yell, to scream, to demand how she could do this to me, to us. But all I could do was sit there, staring at her, my mind racing. "Why?" I finally managed to choke out. "Why would you do that?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," she said, her voice breaking. I was scared and cold, And he was there, and it just happened. I never meant to hurt you, Jack. I love you. I do. But I messed up, and I don't know how to fix it. I didn't know what to say. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, betrayal, heartbreak, and I couldn't sort through them fast enough. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to believe that it was just a mistake, a moment of weakness. But another part of me couldn't shake the image of her and Travis together, their lips meeting in the dim light of the cave. I need some time, I said finally, my voice hoarse. I can't do this right now. She nodded, her shoulders slumping like the weight of the world was on them. I understand, she said softly. I'll go stay somewhere else for a while. Give you the space you need. I didn't argue. I couldn't. My mind was too full, too chaotic, to think clearly. All I knew was that I needed to be alone, to process everything that had just happened. Emily left the next morning, her bags packed and her face pale with guilt and exhaustion. She didn't say much, just hugged me tightly before she walked out the door, her eyes filled with tears. I stood there, watching her go, feeling like my heart was being ripped out of my chest. Over the next few weeks, I tried to make sense of everything. I went through the motions of daily life: work, meals, sleep, but it all fell hollow, like I was just going through the motions. I thought about Emily constantly, wondering where she was, what she was doing, if she was okay. I wanted to hate her, to be angry, but all I felt was a deep, aching sadness. Then, one day, I got a letter from her. It was postmarked from a small town in Washington called Winthrop. I opened it with trembling hands, my heart pounding in my chest. Jack, the letter began, I don't know if you'll ever forgive me for what I've done, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. More sorry than I can ever put into words. I've moved to Winthrop, a small town in the mountains. I've started a hunting and fishing guide service here, trying to rebuild my life. But no matter how far I go, I can't escape the guilt of what I've done. I think about you every day, and I wonder if I'll ever be able to make things right. I love you, Jack. I always will. Emily. I read the letter over and over, my hands shaking. Part of me wanted to get in the car and drive to Winthrop, to beg her to come home. But another part of me knew that I wasn't ready. I wasn't sure if I ever would be. For now, all I could do was hold on to the letter, and the hope that maybe, someday, we could find our way back to each other. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if love was enough. The voicemail came late at night, the sound of Travis' voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Emily had been sitting by the fire in her small cabin in Winthrop, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. She'd been trying to focus on the book in her lap, but her mind kept wandering, drifting back to the past no matter how hard she tried to push it away. When her phone buzzed on the table, she hesitated before picking it up, her heart sinking when she saw the unfamiliar number. She listened to the message with growing dread, her hands trembling as Travis' voice filled the room. Emily, it's me. I know I shouldn't be calling, but I can't stop thinking about you. About us. I need to see you. Please. Just give me a chance to explain. The words hit her like a punch to the gut, her breath catching in her throat. She played the message again, her mind racing. How had he found her? Why couldn't he just leave her alone? She'd worked so hard to rebuild her life, to put the past behind her, and now he was threatening to tear it all down. For a moment, she considered ignoring the message, deleting it and pretending it never happened. But deep down, she knew that wouldn't solve anything. Travis wasn't the kind of man who would just go away. If she didn't confront him, he'd keep coming back, a constant shadow over her life. She stood up, her mind made up. She couldn't let him control her anymore. She had to take control of her own life, no matter what it took. The next morning, Emily packed her bow and a few essentials into her truck, her movements sharp and deliberate. She didn't know where Travis was staying, but she had a good idea. There was only one lodge in Winthrop that catered to hunters, and if he was in town, that's where he'd be. As she drove through the quiet streets of Winthrop, Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, fear, determination, they all warred for dominance, but one thing was clear. She wasn't going to let Travis ruin her life again. She'd made a mistake, but she was determined to make things right, no matter what it took. Unbeknownst to Emily, Jack and her father, Thomas, had been watching her from a distance. They'd been worried about her ever since she'd moved to Winthrop, and when they'd heard about Travis' voicemail, their concern had only grown. They'd decided to follow her, to make sure she was okay, even if she didn't want their help. "You think she's going to do something stupid?" Thomas asked as they trailed behind Emily's truck, keeping a safe distance. Jack shook his head, his eyes never leaving the road. "I don't know. But I do know that she's not the kind of person to just let this go. If Travis is here, she's going to confront him." Thomas sighed, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "I just hope she doesn't do anything she'll regret." Emily pulled up to the lodge, her heart pounding in her chest. She grabbed her bow and slung it over her shoulder, her movements steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She didn't know what she was going to say to Travis, but she knew she couldn't let him control her anymore. She found him in the lobby, his back to her as he talked to the receptionist. For a moment, she just stood there, watching him, her mind racing. Then, taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. "Travis," she said, her voice firm and steady. He turned around, his eyes widening in surprise when he saw her. "Emily," he said, his voice filled with a mix of relief and guilt. I wasn't sure if you'd come." "I'm not here for you," she said, her tone cold. "I'm here to tell you to leave me alone. I don't want to see you. I don't want to talk to you. I just want you to go away." Travis took a step toward her, his expression pleading. "Emily, please. I know I messed up, but I can't stop thinking about you. About us. I just want a chance to make things right." Emily shook her head, her grip tightening on her bow. "There is no us, Travis. There never was. What happened in that cave was a mistake, and I'm not going to let it ruin my life. Now I'm asking you one more time, leave me alone." For a moment, Travis just stood there, his eyes searching hers for any sign of weakness. Then finally he nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Okay," he said softly. "I'll go. But just know that I'm sorry. For everything." Emily didn't respond, just watched as he turned and walked away, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know if he'd really leave her alone, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was in control of her own life. As she walked back to her truck, she saw Jack and Thomas standing by their car, their faces filled with concern. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at them, her mind racing. Then finally, she walked over to them, her bow still slung over her shoulder. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jack stepped forward, his eyes filled with worry. "We were worried about you," he said softly. "We just wanted to make sure you were okay." Emily looked at him, her heart aching with a mix of emotions. She didn't know what to say, how to explain everything she was feeling. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't alone. "I'm okay," she said finally, her voice steady. "I'm going to be okay." And for the first time in a long time, she actually believed it. The forest was eerily quiet as Emily moved through the trees, her bow in hand and her heart pounding in her chest. She'd tracked Travis to a remote campsite deep in the woods, her anger and determination driving her forward. The voicemail he'd left still echoed in her mind, his voice a constant reminder of the chaos he'd brought into her life. She couldn't let him control her anymore. She had to end this, once and for all. As she approached the campsite, she saw him sitting by a small fire, his back to her. He looked relaxed, unaware of her presence, and for a moment, she hesitated. But then she remembered the pain he'd caused, the way he'd torn her life apart, and her resolve hardened. She drew her bow, the string tight against her fingers, and took aim. Her breath was steady, her focus absolute. She released the arrow, and it flew through the air with a sharp whistle, striking Travis in the shoulder. He cried out in pain, collapsing to the ground, and Emily stepped into the clearing, her bow still raised. "Emily!" Travis gasped, clutching his shoulder, his face pale with shock and pain. "What the hell are you doing?" "Ending this," she said, her voice cold and steady. She knocked another arrow, her hands trembling slightly but her aim unwavering. "You don't get to come back into my life and ruin everything. Not again." Travis stared at her, his eyes wide with fear. "Emily, please. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to what?" she snapped, cutting him off. "You didn't mean to cheat with me? You didn't mean to track me down and try to manipulate me again? You don't get to play the victim here, Travis. This ends now." She drew the bowstring back, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, she hesitated, her mind racing with conflicting emotions. But then she thought of Jack, of the life they'd built together, and the pain Travis had caused. She couldn't let him take that away from her. Just as she was about to release the arrow, a voice cut through the tension. "Emily, stop." She froze, her heart skipping a beat. She turned to see Jack and her father, Thomas, stepping into the clearing, their faces filled with shock and concern. "Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" "We followed you," Jack said, his voice steady but his eyes filled with worry. "We were worried about you, Emily. We couldn't let you do something you'd regret." Emily's hands shook as she lowered the bow, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at Travis, then back at Jack, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. I just wanted to make him go away," she said, her voice breaking. "I couldn't let him ruin everything again." Jack stepped forward, his eyes filled with compassion. "I know," he said softly. "But this isn't the way. You're not a killer, Emily. You're stronger than this." Tears streamed down her face as she collapsed to her knees, the weight of everything crashing down on her. "I'm so sorry, Jack," she sobbed. "I never meant to hurt you. I didn't know what to do." Jack knelt beside her, pulling her into his arms. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice filled with love and understanding. "We'll get through this together. I promise." Thomas stepped forward, his expression grim as he looked down at Travis. "I'll take care of him," he said, his voice firm. "He won't bother you again." Emily nodded, her sobs slowly subsiding as she leaned into Jack's embrace. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a sense of peace, like the storm inside her was finally beginning to calm. As they walked away from the campsite, Emily felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. She had Jack by her side, and together, they could face anything. "I love you, Jack," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "I love you too, Emily," he replied, his hand tightening around hers. "And we'll get through this. Together." As they disappeared into the trees, Thomas turned his attention to Travis, his expression hard. "You've caused enough damage," he said, his voice cold. "It's time you faced the consequences of your actions." Travis didn't respond, just stared up at Thomas with a mixture of fear and resignation. As Thomas pulled out his phone to call the authorities, he knew that this was the end of the road for Travis. He wouldn't be able to hurt Emily, or anyone else, ever again. The sun was beginning to set as Emily and Jack reached the edge of the forest, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. They stood there for a moment, hand in hand, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "We'll start over," Jack said, his voice filled with determination. "We'll rebuild our life together, stronger than before." Emily nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Together," she agreed, her heart filled with hope. As they walked away, ready to face the future together, the shadows of the past began to fade, replaced by the promise of a new beginning.